John, it seems like no matter what you read or listen to these days, the main theme has been China, and specifically trade war, tariffs, and how that's going to affect the U.S. economy. Can you give us a simple version of how tariffs work and how they make their way into our economy and how they affect us as consumers?
So, Mark, tariffs are a tax, right? They're a tax imposed by a country on exporting countries, or they're actually not really imposed on the exporting country. They're imposed on the company importing goods into our country, right? So if we impose a tariff tax, that is an extra cost that's going to show up in the price of that good in our economy, eventually, not necessarily immediately. Tariffs have a bad rap, and I think legitimately so. Tariffs, we can go all the way back to Smoot-Hawley, 1930s, which was the imposition of tariffs on Europeans, right? We were already in sort of a dire economic straits back in the Great Depression. Tariffs are credited with deepening that. What's going to happen? Naturally, you impose taxes on European imports. They're going to turn around and impose taxes on U.S. imports into Europe, and now you have a legitimate trade war. That affects certainly exporters, therefore it affects jobs, and therefore it ripples out and hits the entire economy. With regards to China, we've called the tariff situation, the trade war is the kind of the nomenclature used in the media. We've said it's not so much a trade war as it is a negotiation tactic, and I think that continues to be the case. China today is the second largest economy in the world, okay? In history, I think a lot of developed economies have been somewhat more tolerant of developing economies that tend to use protectionism, whether it's tariffs or whether it's subsidies, to kind of shield their own industries from too much competition. And that's been tolerated, but the reality of the matter is that when you have an economy currently the size of China's, a lot of these protectionist impulses from the American perspective, and not just the American perspective, I think most Europeans and developed Asian economies would agree, that they've morphed into other detrimental activities. So we've talked about information theft. We've talked about forced technology transfers. Of course, there's the trade deficit between us and China, and then tariffs that were already imposed over the last couple of decades by China. But those first three are the big ones. So tariffs right now are being used as a negotiation tactic, but I would make the comparison of tariffs as diplomacy of another means, right? Kind of the way military action is diplomacy of another means. Well, we're going to go ahead and force your hand because the Trump administration is not the first presidency to try to negotiate a more reasonable trade arrangement with China. So who pays it? As I said, eventually we, the consumer, will pay it. That depends quite a bit on what's being imported. So if you're in an industry where you have very high barriers to entry, very low competition, chances are you're going to be able to push those increased costs onto the consumers pretty quickly. If you are in an industry where you have low competition, low barriers to entry, it becomes more difficult to pass through tariffs.
Right.
So then that starts to hit your profit margin, it hits your income statement, and you end up possibly with a significant downflow, downward turn in your corporate results. As I said before, it kind of tends to ripple out through the economy. So either way, it's not good for the U.S. consumer. The bet has been that the United States is in a much better position economically to force China's hand through the use of this tactic. And we saw numbers come out over the weekend where the Chinese growth rate seems to have slowed more than most were expecting it, if we use the official government number of 6.2. The U.S., again, remains seemingly in a fairly benign economic environment. But it's a little messier than it's been in the past because over the years, over the last decades, really, it's not just a matter of us making a widget and exporting it to China or Japan or Germany, and whether we pay a tariff or not, it's pretty simple. Supply lines, we are a global economy, supply lines stretch around the world. And I think it was back in November, I used the example of just the iPhone, right? We have the screen is made in Japan, the camera is made in Germany, you have Bluetooth made here in the US, it's assembled by a Taiwan company in the south of China. So you have very complex supply lines. It's not just technology. Auto manufacturers are also known to have very complex supply lines. So it gums up trade, definitely. I think the question right now is, we know that our adversary here is hurting economically. We're a democracy, right? We don't like what the administration is doing. They lose the election. China, as you know, is not. So it's a question of just how much pain do they, what's the pain threshold?
Both sides trying to save face and come out in a win-win situation,
Exactly.
per se. Great, thanks.